All right, welcome back, everyone. So this is the final video of part 5. So this is video 5 of part 5, and this will be the last video in part 5. I definitely didn't think that this was going to be 5 videos long, but that is how it turned out. So in the first video of part 5, we discussed this idea that people who are high in positive schizotypy, given that they also have a certain level of intelligence, can be thought of as having a poetic or a prophetic mind. And the English painter and poet William Blake was somebody who I would suggest definitely had this type of mind. He was a poet, but he also had this prophetic quality to him. And he picked up on, I'm going to suggest, he picked up on many of the ideas that we've been discussing throughout part 5, although they were expressed in his poetry and art implicitly rather than in a sort of explicit scientific way. And we're going to look here, we're going to take a particular look at the figure of Urizen from William Blake's poetry. Urizen was a representation of the god of this world, and I put God in quotation marks there because Blake didn't think that he was the real God, but we'll get to that. So we're going to compare that to John Milton, who is of course another example of this poetic or prophetic mind. John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, and we're going to compare the figure of Urizen to how John Milton wrote about the figure of Satan in Paradise Lost. And we're going to see how all of this was really almost precisely recapitulated in the Matrix movies, in the figure of the architect from the second Matrix movie. So let's do it. As I said, the 18th century English painter and poet William Blake was a very clear example of somebody who had this poetic or prophetic mind. He could detect these noisy patterns that manifested across vast spans of time, but he wasn't picking up on them in a scientific way, right? Or even really in a philosophical way. He was picking up on them in this sort of vague and fuzzy way, and he could articulate them in terms of his poetry. But yeah, of course, he's not a scientist, right? So it's different. But we're going to see, I think it's relatively clear that he was picking up on the same general patterns that we've been talking about. One of these characters in his work was Urizen. And Urizen, we don't know this for sure, but it's very likely that Urizen is a play on the words "your reason." Urizen was a representation of disembodied reason or disembodied rationality. And Urizen for Blake was the god of this world, although in a complicated way, and we'll come back to that. So Roderick Tweedy wrote this extremely interesting, flawed, in my opinion. I mean, there are things that Roderick says in there that I disagree with. So he has like some critiques of Darwinian evolution. He has some critiques of Carl Jung that I think are off point, but that's fine. You're going to find things that you disagree with in any book. I think this is a really interesting book because I think that his main thesis is correct. I think he outlines the argument for his main thesis very convincingly, which is that the figure of Urizen from William Blake's poetry is a representation of the mode of thought that characterizes the left hemisphere of the brain. And we're going to see what I mean by that. So Urizen was depicted by Blake as the architect. That's what he called him at one point in time in his poetry. And he was sometimes depicted as having architect's tools. And he's always depicted as an old man with white hair and a beard. And not a coincidence that Blake associated the rise of Urizen with what Blake called the primeval priests in the first passage of the Book of Urizen. So Blake has a book called the Book of Urizen, and the very first passage associates Urizen with the rise of the primeval priests, which, given what we've talked about in part 5, should not be a coincidence. Blake should not be seen as a coincidence. Blake also associates Urizen with the invention of good and evil and of morality. This should take us back to Nietzsche, because, of course, for Nietzsche, the task of the philosopher is to go beyond good and evil, which is to go beyond the false dichotomies that were set up by the ascetic ideal. And Blake as well. We've already talked about Blake's quote where he picks up on the ascetic ideal. Urizen is the creator of that ascetic ideal, right, for Blake. So the first passage in the Book of Urizen is called the Preludium to the Book of Urizen. Of the primeval priests assumed power when Eternals spurned back his religion and gave him a place in the north, obscure, shadowy, void, solitary. Elsewhere in the Book of Urizen, Blake says, "The spectre," meaning Urizen, "is the reasoning power in man, and when separated from imagination, enclosing itself as in steel in a ratio of the things of memory, it thence frames laws and moralities to destroy imagination. End quote. Okay, so what happens here? When the left hemisphere is disconnected from imagination, intuition, that which deals with emergent anomaly, which is the imagination. That's what the imagination does, essentially, is it provides an imaginative map to deal with emergent anomalies that don't fit into the current category system. So when reason is separated from imagination, it frames laws and moralities to destroy any possibility of emergent anomaly coming to disrupt those, to disrupt the assumptions that it already has. It's something like that. Roderick Tweedy says about the figure of Urizen and its relation to the left hemisphere in his book. He says this, and I quote: "Urizen is Blake's term for that property and activity of the human brain usually called reason, or the rational power. Indeed, the very word is probably in part derived from a pun on your reason. But Urizen's role and capabilities, like those of reason itself, extend far beyond merely rationalization. Urizen is much more than what we commonly understand by reason. He is the limiter of energy, the lawmaker, and the avenging conscience. The precise nature and activity of this rationalizing, lawmaking, moralistic portion of the human psyche has only recently been explored in neuroscience, and I utilize contemporary theories regarding these functions and characteristics in order to clarify Blake's otherwise rather obscure nomenclature. In particular, I draw on recent neuroscientific investigations concerning the division of the human brain into two distinct cerebral regions, the left and right hemispheres, each with their own distinct forms of programming, functions, and even personalities. There are fascinating connections to be made between what Blake terms Urizen and what modern neuroscientists term left hemisphere activity, and I agree," end quote. He goes on a little later to say, and I quote, "Drawing on the cognitive framework provided by Blake, it has been argued that the neurological basis of the entity commonly referred to as God, quote unquote, is grounded in a specific network of interrelated left hemisphere programs, such as its law-making, moralistic, abstracting, dividing, and linear sequencing activities, a network both organized and integrated by a specific left hemisphere mode of attention or personality. Blake believed that the abstract, rationalizing gods of human culture were powerful instantiations of this power within the human brain, which he also termed the holy reasoning power," end quote. And so the suggestion here is that the so-called God that creates the world like an architect from the top down, right, like a designer, engineering God, and the God that frames laws and moralities, which is, of course, the God of the Old Testament, is the God of the left hemisphere. And Urizen, right, what Blake would call Urizen. Elsewhere, Tweedy says about this, and I quote, "Reason pretends that it is neither emotional or moralistic, but it is both. It wants things to be perfect. For, according to Blake, reason is not just an innocent calculating or analytical process within the brain, although it often likes to present itself as this. Blake refers to it as the holy reasoning power, a phrase that captures beautifully its pontificating, judgmental nature, and just as through its development of natural laws it learns to manipulate and control the energy of the universe, so through its development of moral laws it comes to control and regulate both individual and social energy. It is therefore no coincidence that portion of the brain which is preoccupied with rationality and moral judgments is also the one obsessed with lawmaking," end quote. It wants control and predictability, right, which is what the left hemisphere wants. And static moralities, right, the framing of static moralities provides something like that, or at least when everybody shares them, it does. Compelled to impose order on the world of man, just as he seeks to organize the external world according to universal rational laws, Urizen, like the Platonic demiurge in Timaeus, is shocked to discover that real living beings cannot live according to these abstract laws of reason. And he quotes Blake here. Blake says, "He, in darkness closed, viewed all his race, and his soul sickened. He cursed both sons and daughters, for he saw that no flesh nor spirit could keep his iron laws one moment," end quote. And that's Urizen speaking, right? So Urizen was sickened that nobody could keep his laws. Well, of course, we've talked about this with the ascetic ideal. Nobody can act in a purely altruistic way. Nobody can set their reasoning over their instincts, or have reason control their instincts. These are impossible ideals for anybody to live up to. And so, yeah, because they run counter to human nature. They run counter to what we are. And of course, this doesn't stop that aspect of the human psyche from trying to frame these kinds of laws and moralities. But they are impossible to live up to ultimately. Tweedy also describes how the Urizenic attitude is connected to what he sees as the attitude of the priest or priestess. And I quote, "What lurks behind dissociated modern rationality is not pure reason, but pure religion. As we have seen, Blake repeatedly identifies Urizen with the basic program of all religions, whether sacred or profane. I am right, and you are stupid, and I will kill you or dismiss you for your stupidity. This is the priest or high priestess within each human psyche, the delusion of possessing special knowledge that makes the priest better or higher or more intelligent than the uninitiated and the profane. Its basis, Blake suggests, is egoic rationality, and its religion is of superiority and intelligence." End quote. Well, this is what reason is for, fundamentally, right? We talked about this in the last video, or maybe it was 2 videos ago. I don't remember at this point. But Mircea Eliade and Hugo Mercier Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. That's who it was. They wrote the book, The Enigma of Reason, where they go through all the evidence for this, that what reason is for is not for discovering truth about the world. What reason is for justifying the opinions and the beliefs and the decisions that you've already made or that you already have. It says, I am right and you are stupid. That's what reason does in that sense, right? And it's our capacity for imagination that allows us to transcend that, because it allows us to imagine in the first place what it would be like to have a different opinion, right? But also to occupy the perspective of another human being. And this is what imagination is for in large part. And it's why, in positive schizotypy, people high in positive schizotypy have active imaginations, and they also have relatively better theory of mind abilities, because the capacity for imagination and the capacity for theory of mind are essentially the same. And it's that capacity that allows you to transcend the dogmas of reason, let's say. You can make a logical case for almost anything. People have done it for almost anything. Logic is not how we discover truths about the world. It's how we justify the beliefs that we already have to other people, essentially. Imagination, right? The imagination allows us to transcend current frameworks, right? Einstein didn't discover relativity by some chain of logic, right? He had an imaginative leap. And this is how he describes it. This is the way all real breakthrough discoveries are made, through the imagination and not through reason or rationality. So there are some characteristics that we want to derive from this analysis of Urizen, right? The first one is that he is rationalizing, or rational. He is intellectually arrogant. He is lawmaking. He frames laws, and he is moralizing. He's all about morality. So I want to suggest here that if we want to get an idea of what the personality of Urizen was like, I think that the creators of the Matrix movies were picking up on the exact same pattern, right? When they made this figure of the architect. I don't know if they were directly, so it's the Wachowskis. I don't know if the Wachowskis were directly influenced by Blake. They might have. It wouldn't surprise me if they had read Blake. But they're definitely picking up on the same entity with their figure of the architect in the Matrix movies. So within Blake's work, of course, Urizen is repeatedly referred to as a creator and an architect, and the architect within the Matrix movies. And I'm going to assume that you've seen the movies here, okay? So, if you haven't, sorry, but you'll have to go watch them if you want an idea of what I'm talking about. The architect shows up in the second one, The Matrix. I don't remember. I don't remember the name of the second one. Anyways. So the architect of the Matrix movies is the creator or architect of the Matrix. He's an old man with white hair, which is what Urizen looks like. He's arrogant. He is obsessed with control, obsessed with precision, obsessed with rationality. He's hyperverbal, as the left hemisphere would be. He sees the world through representations, right? So he's surrounded by television screens. And so he's never interacting with the world as it is. This is something it's interesting that Ian McGilchrist talks about this in The Master and His Emissary, how the right hemisphere is sort of directly interacting with the world, while the left hemisphere can only see the world through its own representations. And we see this with the figure of the architect, right? He's surrounded by representations of the world, and he's not actually intermingling with the world at all. And so, yeah, we can find all of these attributes looking at Urizen and also looking at the left cerebral hemisphere. Now, I want to point out here, I might make a whole video about this at some point because I think it's really interesting. But the Matrix movies are one of the only, maybe the only like really complete mythological narrative that you're going to find in a movie. And they pull this off, right? So they pull off being a complete mythological narrative because the story occurs on two planes of reality, right? So in the Matrix, right? So within the Matrix, the architect is like the great father figure. It's the tyrannical aspect of the great father. He's the tyrant, and he's literally called the father of the Matrix. And within the Matrix, the great mother is represented by the oracle, right? She's wisdom. The positive aspect of the great mother is wisdom, essentially. She's a representative of wisdom, and she's an agent of positive transformation. And so within the Matrix, Neo is rebelling against the current order of things, against the tyrannical order. But in the real world, right, there's another dynamic going on in the real world, because in the real world, Neo is more of a conservative agent, right? So the great father, in these stories is typically represented by the wise old man who facilitates the initiation rite of the hero, and it's basically a shamanic initiation, which is what Neo goes through to come out into the real world, and so we see the positive aspect of the Great Father in the real world. Of course, he's also in the Matrix too, but you know what I mean. And then the negative aspect of the Great Mother is always just everything that goes bump in the night, right? The terrible mother is all of the terrible aspects of nature. It's the enemy at the gates, right? And it's represented by the machines that exist outside of Zion. And of course, we have Neo, who plays the hero, and Agent Smith, who plays the role of the adversary, who hates existence. Neo does what he does out of his love for existence, you might say, and Smith does what he does because he has this brooding resentment about existing at all. And then, Trinity plays the role of the anima, which we see in many mythological narratives, the feminine counterpart of the hero, which draws the hero out of his. So she's the anomaly at the beginning, right? So in the beginning of the Matrix movies, he sees on his computer screen, knock, knock, Neo, and it's a message from Trinity, which draws Neo out of his hiding place, let's say, and draws him to fulfill his destiny. You see the same thing in The Lion King, where Simba is in exile, and then the anima, which is Nala, comes and finds him and draws him out to go fulfill his destiny. And so we see the same thing in the Matrix movies. But anyway, so you see how this it represents an almost complete mythology, right? Because it has all the main sort of characters that every mythological narrative has, but it can have them in both their positive and negative guises, because it occurs on two different planes of reality, which I think the Wachowskis are geniuses for doing that. I don't know. I'm sure they didn't explicitly do that because they're not like intellectuals, but I think that they're creative geniuses for figuring out how to do that. So moving on. So for Blake, Urizen was the architect of the moral matrix, right? We talked last in the last video about moral matrices, Jonathan Haidt's idea that morality is a matrix. Urizen is the architect of that matrix. And so Tweedy talks about this as well, and I quote, "One of the most significant of all the artificial abstractions produced by Urizenic reasoning, according to Blake, is the conceptual separation of good and evil, that is, the basis of what is called morality. Indeed, Blake's opposition to orthodox moral codes is one of the most explosive elements of his entire work. The moral virtues, he asserts, are continual accusers of sin and promote eternal wars and domineering over others." Blake maintained that the basis for most moral systems was not the disinterested, holy love of virtue that its practitioners pretended to be, but rather the rationalistic love of domineering and the social and personal control that this allows through moral systems. This would help explain why so many religions have been obsessed with sin, or evil as it is more often called today, since this concept is a highly effective way of maintaining moral superiority, the basis of the Urizenic selfhood. In other words, it is the accusers of sin, that is to say, the morally self-righteous, not the sinners, who are the problem. As Blake succinctly puts it, in hell, all is self-righteousness, end quote. And I couldn't agree more with Blake on that as far as I'm concerned. Self-righteousness is the problem. It's a much bigger problem than sin, let's say, as far as I can tell. So, this aspect of Blake's thought was clearly echoed by Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm not sure if Nietzsche ever read Blake. He never mentioned him, but clearly there's a whole lot of overlap between the way that William Blake conceptualized the world and the way that Friedrich Nietzsche conceptualized the world, because Nietzsche saw the world this way as well, right? That it's not, it's those who have framed moralities have been the problem, let's say, and not those who disrupted those frames. So John Milton wrote Paradise Lost. I think another clear example of what you might call the poetic or the prophetic mind. And the figure of Satan in Paradise Lost has been implicitly associated with reason. And it's a really interesting association, right, between Satan and reason. But so in the story of Paradise Lost, Satan, who is the highest angel in the hierarchy of angels, foments rebellion against God. And as a consequence of that rebellion, he is cast out of heaven into hell, where he rules eternally over the sinful dead. And so we might ask, what is the meaning of this story? Interestingly, Blake wrote a lot about Milton. He was very heavily influenced by Milton. And Blake has a poem called Milton where he comments on this story, and he says, and I quote, "For Satan created 7 deadly sins, drawing out his infernal scroll of moral laws and cruel punishments upon the clouds of Jehovah, to pervert the divine voice in its entrance to the earth, saying, I am God alone, there is no other. Let all obey my principles of moral individuality," end quote. Milton's Satan for Blake is equivalent to the god of this world called Urizen, which, if you're familiar with Neoplatonic or Gnostic ideas, this is basically the same as the Gnostic idea of the demiurge. I don't have enough expertise on that kind of stuff to comment on that too much, but is clearly picking up on a very similar idea, I think. In Maps of Meaning, Jordan Peterson suggested that Paradise Lost was a metaphorical representation of the rise of what you might call rationality in the modern world. And so this is what Jordan Peterson said about that in Maps of Meaning, and I quote, "Christian mythology portrays Satan as the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom. This fact renders his association with reason more comprehensible. Reason may well be considered the highest angel, which is to say the most developed and remarkable psychological or spiritual faculty characteristic of all men, and therefore something transpersonal and eternal. Reason, the most exceptional of spirits, suffers from the greatest of temptations. Reason's own capacity for self-recognition and self-admiration means endless capacity for pride, which is the act of presuming omniscience. It is reason's remarkable ability, and its own recognition of that ability, that leads it to believe it possesses absolute knowledge and can therefore replace or do without God," end quote. And I would say that this is the same story that Ian McGilchrist told in The Master and His Emissary. It's the same story fundamentally. It is because, in The Master and His Emissary, Ian argued essentially that it is the left hemisphere's remarkable ability, right? And because it is remarkable, and its own recognition of its own ability, that leads it to believe that it possesses absolute knowledge and can therefore replace or do without the right hemisphere. Because the right hemisphere is that which deals with everything that exists outside of the categories of the left hemisphere. But reason can, as Jordan Peterson says here, reason can fall in love with its own creations and can assume that they're absolute and can make them static, right? And assume that they don't need to be updated, which means that you can do without the transcendent, right? You can do without anything that exists outside of your current conceptualizations. And that's the, the emissary usurping the master. And it's the same thing that was being described in Milton's Paradise Lost, and it's the same thing that was described by William Blake in his figure of Urizen, I would suggest. So we can see that Blake has made this strange connection between the God of traditional religion and Milton's figure of Satan from Paradise Lost. And so God and Satan here are collapsed down to being the same entity. The God of the left hemisphere is the same as what Milton called Satan, and what Peterson, Jordan Peterson in Maps of Meaning, called the spirit of unbridled rationality, which is the adversary, which is just another way of saying Satan. These are different ways of representing this process that was described by Ian McGilchrist and the Master and his emissary. It's the usurpation of the Master, which is the right hemisphere, by the emissary, which is the left hemisphere. And the left hemisphere mode, let's say, has culturally, through the figures of the priests, through the priestly religions, let's say, has presented itself as God, right? As this engineering, top-down creator God who frames laws and moralities. But this is the God of the left hemisphere, essentially. And so now what I need to do here is try to make an attempt to explain why it is that the mode of attention that characterizes the right hemisphere, which also characterizes people high in positive schizotypy, ought to be understood as the master of the psyche, right? So we're using this master and emissary metaphor. Why is it that the right hemisphere is the rightful master? Well, I think there's a very good reason for it. And it's not because it's superior, right? It's not because the right hemisphere is better than the left hemisphere. Both hemispheres are useful and necessary. And it's not that people high in positive schizotypy are better than people high in autistic-like traits either. Both modes of attention are necessary and useful. They have their pros and cons. The reason why the right hemisphere is the master of the psyche is because it is capable of seeing the big picture and the left hemisphere is not. Right? That's basically it. The right hemisphere mode of attention can see, it can perceive the insufficiency of the current order, and the left hemisphere mode of attention can never see past its own assumptions. That means it's always going to be static. It is always going. It can never transform itself. The right hemisphere is the agent of transformation. And the right hemisphere, because it can see the big picture, right? The right hemisphere can see the obvious usefulness of the left hemisphere mode of attention, but the left hemisphere mode of attention cannot see the usefulness of the right hemisphere mode. It doesn't understand. It never understands. And I see this with individual differences too. I think it's far more obvious to people on the positive schizotypy end of the continuum, let's say, what the utility of the autistic kind of cognition is, because it is that engineering mode. It's what creates, it's what's contributed to much of the scientific enterprise, although not nearly all of it. I mean, science often involves imaginative leaps, like Darwin, for example, but it is that mode of attention that can be extremely powerful in creating artificial intelligence, and the computer that I'm using right now, and it's the engineering mindset, right? And that mindset has real power. But it is harder, I think, for people on that side of the continuum, let's say, to see the utility of the other kind of attention, right? The more global, fuzzy, big picture kind of attention. So, we've talked about this before, but I just want to go back over it briefly here. Right, so the autistic or the left hemisphere mode of attention is very good at dealing with precise and complex patterns, right? So that's on the left side of this figure here. We have a pattern that is complex because it has lots of ups and downs, but it's precise, right? There's no noise in the pattern. And people with that mode of attention are very good at picking up on those kinds of patterns. And people with the other kind of attention, my kind of attention, aren't very good at picking up on those kinds of patterns, right? They're going to impose simplifying assumptions onto the input, and so this means that I would never be a great organic chemist, right? Okay, it's not in the cards for me, right? So it's not the kind of cognition that I have, right? And so people high in positive schizotypy, they underfit when dealing with these precise, complex patterns. On the other hand, right, the autistic or left hemisphere mode of attention is not very good at picking up on noisy patterns because it overfits, right? Because it tries to fit things too precisely. So the right hemisphere or positive schizotypy kind of attention, that's what picks up on these noisy, generalizable patterns. But that's the same thing as talking about the big picture, right? Because those are the patterns that generalize across many different situations. The more general the pattern is, the more it generalizes across many different situations, and therefore the more noisy it's going to be, and the more you're going to have to ignore the details of any particular situation to pick up on that underlying pattern, right? And that's what the right hemisphere does, and that's what it's good at, and that's why it sees the big picture, right? It sees the way things are going, let's say, in the overall picture of things. And so I'm going to read something which is from the 2014 paper by Sander van der Kroijs and colleagues on the predictive processing account of autism. And I'm going to read this and then we'll unpack it a little bit. It's going to help us to understand this master and emissary relationship. Even though this is about autism, I'm going to suggest that the same thing applies to the left hemisphere. So they said about this, and I quote, "Indiscriminately high precision will mean that unrepeated accidental variations in the input receive disproportionate weight. This in turn prevents abstract representations from being formed because matching will continue on a more specific level closer to the input. Indiscriminately high precision also induces superfluous learning, leading to narrowly defined lower-level predictions and incomplete hierarchical models. Setting precision high by default may give an advantage for lower-level processing, but it impedes building and using a hierarchy of predictions for generalization." Okay, end quote. Okay, so you can think of beliefs and values and goals as being arranged in a kind of hierarchy of abstraction, right, with the more general stuff at the top and the more specific inputs at the bottom. Okay, people high in autistic-like traits, people with autism, they're very good at dealing with the stuff at the bottom of the hierarchy. Right, and so that's going to be stuff that's very precise, very concrete. Now you may say, okay, mathematics is not concrete. Mathematics is abstract. Yes, that's true. But when you put a mathematical equation onto a piece of paper, you've taken this abstract concept and you've made it concrete in some important way. We're not going to go into that too much here. I think it's a philosophical issue. But the point is that those very precise ways of paying attention to the world are good for dealing with stuff that's at the bottom end of the hierarchy of generalization. And so this is just a figure. So this is a very ugly figure, I think, but whatever. I made it a long time ago to try to express this hierarchy of abstraction, right? So at the top of the hierarchy, you have the questions that Ann Taves and colleagues would consider worldview questions. So these are questions about like what exists, what should I be doing in general, right? What is the world like at a very fundamental level? And then you're going to have mid-level goals and beliefs. So these are maybe career goals or political beliefs, and then lower level goals and beliefs. I need to pass this test. I need to perform a particular scientific study to test my hypothesis, whatever. And then you might have subroutines. Things like solving an equation or brushing your teeth or driving to school. But even below that, right, you're going to have even more basic subroutines of just your basic motor activity. So we have this hierarchy of abstraction where we have very concrete things at the bottom, more abstract and generalizable things at the top. So the difference between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. We've talked about this in terms of precision weighting, and I didn't go into too much detail about that because it's really abstract and a little bit complicated. You can read my papers if you want to know about that. But this is how it cashes out. And again, this is a very ugly figure. I know that, okay? But this is the best I could come up with to try to convey what's going on here. So people high in autistic-like traits in the left hemisphere, that mode of attention, pays attention to details. And that means it's dealing with a lot of prediction errors a lot of the time. And that means that those prediction errors, they just don't travel very far up the hierarchy, right? They stay at lower levels of the processing hierarchy. This is what van der Kroijs and colleagues were talking about in that quote from earlier. Prediction errors stay down here at more concrete or detailed levels of the hierarchy. People high in positive schizotypy, or the right hemisphere, on the other hand, right? They don't pay attention to details, right? So they're not paying attention to details, and that means that they're dealing with less sensory input than somebody else would be. People high in positive schizotypy are often described as like living in a kind of dream all the time, right? They're kind of, they've got their head in the clouds all the time. I do. I've got my head in the clouds all the time, right? I'm barely paying attention to what's going on around me at all. And that's been true of me my entire life. But that is how people high in positive schizotypy are. They're constantly sort of in their imagination. But that's what this is, right? So this, the imagination is literally when you are sort of manipulating what's going on at higher levels of abstraction in the processing hierarchy. And so because people high in positive schizotypy or the right hemisphere, they're dealing with less of the concrete details of sensory input. It allows them to pick up on those aspects of the world that are more generalizable. And so they're paying more attention to the big picture. They're constructing, worldviews, essentially, is what they're doing. So hopefully this figure makes a little bit of sense. I know it's kind of ugly, but It's the best I could come up with to explain this difference between the hemispheres. So why is the right hemisphere master then? It's master because it constructs worldviews, and the left hemisphere cannot do that. So Taves and colleagues in this 2018 paper about worldviews, they describe a worldview as such. They say, and I quote, "We understand worldviews as a complex set of representations related to big questions such as, in the first place, ontology, which is what exists or what is real, epistemology, which is how do we know what is true, axiology, which is what is the good that we should strive for, praxeology, which is what actions we should take, and cosmology, which is where do we come from and where are we going, that define and govern a way of life." Right? So those are the questions that basically make up a worldview. And they suggest in that same paper that there are certain abilities, certain cognitive abilities that underlie the ability to construct an explicit worldview. I'm not going to go through their argument in detail, but they point out that theory of mind is important, self-reflection is important, mental time travel is important, narrative synthesis is important, and symbolic representation is important. And what I want to point out here is that all of these are at a deficit in autism, all of those. And I talk about this in my 2022 paper on autistic-like traits and positive schizotypy, but all of those are at a deficit in autism and are associated with the mode of attention that characterizes the right hemisphere and positive schizotypy, which is why that's the mode of attention that constructs worldviews, right? It pays attention to those particular questions. While the left hemisphere and people high in autistic-like traits, they tend to pay attention to more precise issues, right? And more practical issues in some sense. Even though I think worldviews are intensely practical, they're not as obviously practical as building a bridge is, for example. So the right hemisphere essentially creates the world in which the left hemisphere acts, but the left hemisphere eventually comes to think that it can do without the right hemisphere. And that happens when things, I would suggest it happens when things become very stable, because then you might come to think that you can do without novelty, right? True novelty. And Jordan Peterson describes this process in the Secure the Dawn video called Utopia. And he says, and I quote, "In Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan decides that he can do without the transcendent. He decides that he can do without God, and that's why he foments rebellion. And the consequence of that was that when Satan decided that what he knew was sufficient and that he could do without the transcendent, which you might think of as the domain outside of what you already know, immediately he was in hell," end quote. And so that's the basic story, right? The left hemisphere believes that it can do without the transcendent, right? Or that mode of attention believes that it can do without the transcendent, but it's wrong, right? It's always wrong because there's always unknown categories, right, that exist outside of your current system. So we've already talked about the research indicating that the left hemisphere ignores or downplays anomalous information, right? It can't reconstruct itself in the face of anomalous information. And what I would suggest is that when the world becomes stable enough, that mode of attention may come to believe erroneously that it doesn't need that other mode, right? The poetic or the prophetic mind, which is there to deal with anomaly, right? Imagination, right? That's what imagination is. It's there to deal with truly anomalous information. And I would suggest that this is what has happened and has been continuing to happen in the modern world since the advent of agriculture, right? The advent of agriculture effectively stabilized the environment. It made it so that your life was very much likely to look like your father's life and your grandfather's life and so on, right? If you were all farmers all the way down the line. And of course, it also put us in this situation where we were all together in a relatively stable civilization. And it may be the case, right, that in that situation, the right hemisphere mode becomes less important. But the problem comes when it comes to be downplayed as being of any importance at all. And so when Nietzsche declared the death of God, it was only the left hemisphere God who was pronounced dead, really. I don't think Nietzsche fully understood it. We'll talk about that later on, but he was announcing the death of that God, right? That particular conception of God. What I would suggest, what Blake would suggest, what William Blake would suggest is that was not the real God, right? That was a false God, let's say, what you might call a false God. And it's the same as the God so at the beginning of part 5, I read this quote from Zarathustra, who is the great dragon, whom the Spirit will no longer call Lord and God. Thou shalt is the name of the great dragon. Right? Thou shalt, which is what frames laws and morality. But the spirit of the lion says, I will. Nietzsche's dragon, right? It's clear just from the context of understanding Nietzsche. If you understand Nietzsche, you'll understand that what he's talking about there is the same as Urizen. It's the same as Blake's Urizen. It's the same as the figure of Satan in Paradise Lost. It's the same as Peterson's spirit of unbridled rationality. It's the architect of the Matrix, the architect of the moral matrix. And that's what Nietzsche is talking about there. It's the false god who frames laws and morality, who says, thou shalt. And if you're familiar, right, with popular portrayals of Gnosticism or Neoplatonism, you'll be aware that this sounds a lot like the demiurge from those. I'm not going to go into that into detail, in any amount of detail, because I'm not nearly an expert on that stuff. I don't really understand Neoplatonism that well, or Gnosticism that well. I've read a little bit more about Gnosticism, but Gnosticism is really an umbrella term. Right? People talk about it as if it's one thing, but it's not. Like there's multiple versions of Gnostic Christianity, let's say. But yeah, this is definitely something that's very similar to the idea of the demiurge within those modes of thought. The god of the left hemisphere, right, as we've been discussing it, is a god of order, and it's a god of rationality and stability and structure. What I would suggest is that chaos is back. Right? We're back into a, we've been in a period of order for a very long time, really since the advent of agriculture, but chaos is back. And Terence McKenna picked up on this pattern too, I think, and so I'm going to read something that he said about this, and I quote, "My notion is that the world as we experience it is a struggle between two different kinds of forces. On the one side is habit. And what is habit? It's what has come before, repetitious, predictable, entropic, recursive, iterative. And the other thing is novelty. Novelty is complexity, symmetry breaks, the improbable, the unusual, the unexpected, the unstable. And so you see there is this ebb and flow, this tension between these two things in every moment. In the last 5 minutes, in the last 5 millennia, in the last 5 billion years, there has been a struggle between these two forces, and they can be mathematically portrayed just like the rise and fall of temperature or a stock or any other numerical quality. They can theoretically be portrayed in this way. Then, where we are now, if we think of habit as a rising of this imaginary Cartesian graph, and habit as falling into novelty, deeper into novelty, we say, a plunge into novelty, then where we are now is creeping along the highest edge of a plateau of habit, recidivism, constipation, conservatism, habitual thinking, and so forth, inevitably approaching a dramatic collapse in that style of behavior caused by many different vectors coming together." End quote. And I'll put the link to that in the description. And I agree. I think he's right. I think that we are on the verge of a phase change, essentially. Yeah. I mean, that is what McKenna is suggesting, that we are on the cusp of a phase change. And as he put it elsewhere, and I think he's right about this as well, he said, chaos is what we've lost touch with. This is why it's given a bad name. It is feared by the dominant archetype of our world, which clinches because its existence is defined in terms of control, right? And that's Urizen, right? That's that dominant archetype. And I agree. And so the return of chaos is going to be the focus of part 6. This is the end of part 5, right? This was about, part 5 was me trying to tell the story of how it is that we came to be tilted too much towards order, and the advent of agriculture, which brought about the rise of the priests and the priesthoods, who framed morality and values in a particular way and created a particular kind of God. All of this was the elevation of order over chaos, the inappropriate. Now, I say inappropriate, but it was necessary for what happened, right? I mean, it's not like I'm not making a moral judgment about this. It's not. It was perhaps necessary for that period, but it's over, right? Chaos is back as far as I'm concerned, and that is what we're going to talk about in part 6. Part 6 is going to be called "The Return of the Great Mother." Not the death of God. That was what I originally was going to call it. It's going to be called The Return of the Great Mother, and it's about the return of chaos and what we might do about that. So, see you there.